This is a production of Cornell University.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
We hear you wonderfully, Peter. Welcome.
Great. Well, good to be with you all virtually today. Let's jump right in. So these are the topics I'm going to talk about, presented as the take-home messages. So I'm not going to read all of these, but that gives you an idea of where we're going during the next half an hour. And we'll come back to all of these again at the end. Just following up on Jenny's introduction, our focus today is land that's not currently in forests and not currently in agricultural production in New York State in particular. But of course, this applies to many other parts of the US as well. So I just want to start with a little historical perspective about forests in New York State, and this applies to much of the northeastern USA. Prior to European settlement, most of the area was forested, and that decreased through the 1700s and 1800s. Since around 1900, forest area has been increasing again, and that's because the agriculture, much agricultural production has shifted to the higher productivity soils in the Midwest. So we've had an increase in forest area in the last 100 years. So where did that land come from that is now this new forest? Well, the total farmland has decreased over this time period. But the cropland, meaning where we're growing row crops, so the more intensive agriculture on the best lands, we're using just about the same area as we have been for quite a long time. So the cropland's been fairly stable, but a lot of the more marginal, hilly, sloped land has gone out of production. So I just want to talk a little bit about this jargon of marginal lands and idle lands. What do we mean by these? Well, idle lands is really just meaning that it's not currently in commercial production of some kind. It's really a wide variety of land cover, meaning what the land looks like. So some of it's grasses and shrubs, some is young forest or beginning forest. Some of it's used for hunting or other purposes. It's hard to get a handle on these lands because they kind of are the gaps in many surveys. So if they're not in agricultural production, they're not really going to get picked up in the agricultural surveys. And if they're not forest land, even if they might have some young trees on them, they may not be picked up in forest surveys. There was a survey in New York State of land used for horses, and it was found to be more than 1 million acres. And many of these idle lands are marginal. So that's the next little bit of jargon to talk about. And here's a quote from almost 100 years ago, that the word marginal has been used too glibly as a convenient way to say land that is barren, rough, or has other undesirable characteristics. So often when we talk about marginal land, people think about kind of the physical aspects of that land, whether it's low productivity soils or slopes. But there's also a strong economic component. And this term marginal is really an economic term to say that it's marginal for agricultural or commercial production, for economic activity. In other words, the cost to produce something, you may not get that back. There may be no profit at all in producing some kinds of crops on these lands. Well, that means that what's marginal to one person or one operation might not be to another. So land that might be marginal for corn production could be just fine for wine grapes. So we did an analysis of how much of this land might be available for different purposes, such as bioenergy production, or in what we're talking about today, growing new forest or afforestation. So we used a combination of the available data. So that included spatial data derived from remote sensing, as well as survey data about agricultural production. We eliminated small parcels because we were thinking about adding some type of production, and we thought it was more practical to do that on the larger parcels of land. We also assumed that not all landowners would want to use this land for any purpose, whether it's growing trees or any other type of harvest. And to jump to the result, we came up with, after applying some of these filters about small parcels, sloping lands, as well as landowner interest, we came up with an estimate of 1.7 million acres. So just to be clear, there's much more of this land out there, but we don't think it's likely that all of it would be used for any particular purpose. There have been other studies. Of course, there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. So a more recent analysis found a higher value, basically a similar analysis, but it's a question about the assumption of how much of that land might be available. So how do idle lands fit into overall land use in the state? So here's just a picture, a pie chart showing that most of the land in New York is forested, that there's a substantial amount that's developed. There are wetlands, there's open water, croplands, grasslands. And then this idle land we're talking about is about 5% of the state. And then scrub land, so land that has some shrubs in it, is about 3%. So what could we do with these lands? Well, that's our topic for today. So I'm going to just mention a few possibilities here. We could grow bioenergy feedstocks, and we've published analysis on the potential for using these lands for this purpose. We could also grow more livestock feed. That could be hay or other forage crops. It could also be increased use of pasture for livestock. The next talk you're going to hear this morning is solar panels, and more generally thinking about renewable energy production on these lands. And then again, just that there are many other uses for this land, recreation, wildlife, habitat, etc. I'm going to be focusing on the opportunity for growing new forests on these lands. Well, the reason we're thinking about growing forests is we can store quite a bit of carbon. So forests, as they grow, are removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in growing trees. And this is part of a whole, what they're calling here, a closed loop of forest carbon in the atmosphere. So we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere into trees, and then we can use those for energy. They can be lost due to fire or disease or other mortality. We can put them into wood products that may last quite a long time. So we can sequester carbon from the atmosphere in houses and chairs, etc. So forests the reason we focus on forests for storing carbon is they really can store quite a bit. And that's primarily in trees, but also in soil as well. We heard in the introduction from Jenny a little bit about the New York State context in terms of the Community Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. what I want to focus on here is this requirement for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So emissions need to be reduced by 85%, but then also needing to get to net zero. And the reason for that is people who analyze greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities across all sectors, it's very, very hard to get that last bit of emissions to zero. It's very difficult and very expensive. So that's the law allows that last 15% to be achieved by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there is a draft scoping plan of ways to achieve these goals that's available for public comment currently. Excuse me. So here's just an example of carbon sequestration in a typical northern hardwood stand in the region. So the black line at the top is the total carbon after the stand starts to grow. So if you started with an old field and if you planted trees or had trees naturally growing and you had a healthy stand, you'd accumulate carbon rapidly for more than 100 years, and eventually it would begin to level off. The red line is the next one to the top, and that's the live trees. So again, just showing that most of the carbon in the forest that's growing is in the live trees themselves. And here's a picture of what this may look like, with some young trees growing in a former agricultural field or pasture. So why haven't forests already regrown on old farmland? Well, the reason is there's a lot of competition there. So the grasses and other vegetation can suppress the trees. And a big issue is also deer. They can browse 1,000 tree seedlings a day and prevent that forest from regrowing. So there are many places we can plant trees, and I just want to briefly mention a few of them and then focus back on these former agricultural lands. So we could plant trees in former agricultural lands. And as we're talking about today, there is competition for these lands. We could also plant more trees in developed urban and suburban areas. And that can have a lot of benefits. It's also an expensive proposition. And I'm not going to be focusing on that today. We can plant trees to increase forest stocking, which just means increasing the number of trees. So if we have a young forest that maybe there's heavy deer pressure and there aren't enough young seedlings, if we could plant some seedlings in that forest and protect them from deer, we can increase the growth rate of existing forests. And again, this is an important opportunity for New York State and other places. I just want to mention this briefly, even though we're not focusing on remaining forests today. We also want to be thinking about planting native tree species that are adapted to climate change. So we might want to be planting species and varieties that are suitable for the future climate that we're expecting in coming decades, not necessarily the climate we've had in previous decades. So this slide just summarizes some of the opportunity and the barriers here. So we calculated that if we planted trees successfully on this 1.7 million acres, we could sequester almost 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. In the long run, this could also be producing long-lived wood products. This calculation is just for storing carbon in the growing forest. There are, of course, other competing opportunities. We'll be talking about some of those. I'll talk about those a little bit more, and then in the next session, we'll be hearing about solar and renewable energy. So what are some of the barriers to this idea of tree planting? Well, I've mentioned existing deer, pests, and invasive shrubs can prevent forests from regrowing. This land is also typically owned by private landowners in small parcels. So there's a real issue about communicating with folks, sharing the opportunity, even if people are interested. It's a big project to get a lot of small parcels of land planted. There's variable soil quality, and of course, landowners have many interests and goals for their land. There are also substantial costs to tree planting and protecting those seedlings from deer and competing vegetation. So in summary, there's a lot of possibility here, but there are lots of unknowns and lots of work would be required to actually have a large tree planting effort. So I'll just briefly mention we can also add trees to current agricultural land. So this is called agroforestry. So mixing in some forestry production with agriculture. So this is an example of a silvopasture, which means silvo for trees and pasture for livestock. So this is growing black locust and black walnuts trees as crops, the black locust for fence posts and the walnut for valuable trees over a long time period, and also livestock production. So I'm not going to be focusing on this, but I just want to mention that there is substantial potential to add trees to agricultural land, as well as former agricultural land. Additionally, we're focusing on planting trees for sequestering carbon. But of course, there are lots of values to forests. And in many cases, people may value some of those other benefits of forests equally or more so than the carbon benefits. This is important to remember if we're comparing using tree planting as a way to store carbon compared to some other efforts. So there are technological efforts to remove carbon from the atmosphere using industrial processes. Even if those are affordable and successful, they're not going to provide all of the other benefits provided by a forest. When we think about carbon sequestration, there are some important criteria. So we want it to be permanent or at least very long-term. Climate change is a long-term issue, so we also need solutions that are long-term. So think about that. Are trees and forests permanent? Well, I would say probably not, but if they're healthy, they can be very long-term in areas at least where you don't have frequent forest fires and things like that, that kind of disturbance. We also want carbon sequestration to be real and additional. So we want it to be on top of what we're doing already. And in this case, we want actual reductions of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But what this means is we don't want to just plant trees in one area and cut trees down in some other area. That's called leakage. And if that happens, there's no real benefit to the climate at all. And then verifiable. We want to make sure if we're making an effort to sequester carbon that we really are storing carbon. An advantage of trees is they can be measured and we can pretty accurately estimate how much carbon is being stored in them. So again, we want to remember always that there are other options. So we looked at using this same land base for growing, as I mentioned, growing grasses or other materials for bioenergy feedstocks. We also looked at the possibility of increased grazing and beef production on these lands. So this next slide is what's called technical potential. So this would be if we use this entire land base of 1.7 million acres for these activities. And again, there are many reasons why that would be challenging to reach that technical potential. So we use data from forage trials. So this is growing forage for livestock in a fairly intensive manner. So using enough fertilizer and other practices to have high productivity. And this could be, for example, for beef production. So this is showing multiple different products we could produce on some portions of this land. So a little bit of hay land, land that's in herbaceous cover, so grasses and other small plants, and then lands that's in shrubs. The red bars are beef, the black is ethanol, if we use the bioenergy feedstock to produce a liquid fuel, using it for pellets, or the green is for hay. And this is just showing the value of these products. This isn't the profitability, just showing that there are multiple different products we could produce from this land that could potentially have value to society. But how do owners want to manage their land? This is a survey from quite a few years ago now, and there's some ongoing work with a new survey that should be ready shortly. But owners of idle land, most of them have no plans to sell the land or to return it to active agriculture. 10% do plan to sell their land within 10 years, and only about 10% of buyers are expected to be farmers. So the trend here, if this older survey data is still applies today, is less and less of an emphasis on agricultural production. A third of this land is managed by occasional mowing, and a third has no management plan at all. Okay, so we're back to the take-home messages, and then I'll just have a few slides of some follow-up information. So as we've talked about, we've estimated about 1.7 million acres of former agricultural land could be available for multiple purposes. As I mentioned, we actually estimated much more than this, more than 3 million acres, but we don't think it's feasible to consider that all of that land would be mobilized and used for any specific purpose, because people have so many different interests in what they want to do with their land. Again, New York State has a legal mandate of net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And planting trees is a natural and proven way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So to help to get to that net zero, a critical opportunity. I mentioned costs just briefly, and I'm not focusing on that today, but I did mention that there are substantial costs to planting trees and protecting them from deer and competing vegetation. But if we think about the costs of the damage from climate change, then the costs of growing trees might be quite affordable as a greenhouse gas mitigation strategy. And planting trees on this 1.7 million acres of land could sequester almost 5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. So this would represent about adding about 22% to the sequestration in current forests. So it's actually, that gives an idea of how ambitious this strategy would be. However, that amount is only 12% of the carbon dioxide removal that has been estimated to be needed by 2050. In other words, it doesn't get us anywhere near that 15% of emissions reductions that modeling efforts have identified will probably be needed. So how could we increase that amount? Well, we could plant faster growing trees. We could plant trees on additional lands. And we can also increase the growth rate of existing forests. So there are opportunities to sequester more than this amount on the 1.7 million acres that we identified. On the other hand, there's competition for this land, for recreation, livestock grazing, hay production, etc. So further information about this topic is available on our website, which is at the bottom of this slide. And in particular, there's a report that we produced that's linked from there that includes this opportunity for afforestation, along with many other key opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and forest sectors. As I mentioned, there's a New York State Climate Action Council draft scoping plan. If you're interested to see the different ways, including afforestation, that are being proposed by the state to achieve the goals and the legal mandates for greenhouse gas mitigation. I mentioned a more recent study about reforestation opportunity. And one important thing for some in the audience, this is a national study, this US Reforestation Hub by the Nature Conservancy. So they produce estimates not only for New York State, but for every other state in the country. And here's the literature cited, and we can provide that later for any of you who are interested. And again, this will be posted on our website in about a week. The recording of this presentation, it'll be available there. I want to thank the funding sources for this work, the Climate and Applied Forestry Research Institute and USDA Smith-Lever project. And lastly, we have two more presentations this morning, and then May 10th, as Jennifer mentioned, there'll be another webinar focusing on food waste specifically. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. I realized in introducing you, I was very formal. Okay, so there's some really great questions, and I'm going to go in an asymmetric order, not in the order that they arrived. And Jen just posted a quick poll in your window if you could respond to that. So I'm going to take the first question from Tim. Thanks, Peter. Great overview. What is the timeline for the 4.9 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year? Is this over a 20, 40, 80-year time frame? Do you have an estimate of the rate of sequestration, which would be lower at the start and then accelerate?
A good question. I'm trying to remember, this was an average annual value. I believe it was across a 30-year period, but I'm not sure of that. That average wouldn't vary too much going a little bit above or below a 30-year period. As you and many others know, in the very long run, this sequestration would slow down. So I showed one example for a maple beech birch stand where well after 100 years, sequestration slows down, and in much older stands, sequestration becomes much slower than what we're talking about here. And that's where some forest management would be required at that point to maintain sequestration rates, harvesting material for wood products, etc.
So I'm just going to quickly follow up with a question from Tom Giroux. Peter, how long would it take to get the 4.9 million metric tons of sequestration if it were all planted in year one?
I don't have an exact answer for that. Again, this was an average sequestration rate per year over a long, about a 30-year period. So after the stand is planted, it's going to take a decade or two to achieve that kind of rapid growth rate. I'm sorry I don't have a more exact answer. We did, as an aside, we did assume that the average growth rate of these stands would be that maple beech birch stand example that I showed, which is based on measured growth rates throughout the Northeast region for maple beech birch stands. So if you look back at that growth curve, both of these questions can be answered, I think, by looking at that curve.
So Scott Fickborn asks, you mentioned not including smaller parcels in your analysis. What was the lower threshold? Also, in the approximate 5 million metric tons per year max estimate, how many trees per acre were you using?
Okay, so the threshold for small parcels was 2 hectares. And again, this is an assumption. There's no reason you can't plant trees on a small parcel. We eliminated those because we originally performed this analysis to look at bioenergy production, and we just thought it was more practical to think about larger fields. So again, there's no technical reason why you couldn't do it, but if you imagine mobilizing people and materials and projects, it's going to be easier to mobilize and conduct those on larger parcels than on the smaller parcels. But again, there's no reason why that technically couldn't be done. And sorry, I lost the second question.
It was how many trees per acre were you using in your assumption?
Good question. So again, we assumed that the growth rate that would be achieved would be the average growth rate of existing maple beech birch stands in the Northeast. And I don't have a number in mind for what that stocking rate represents, but that would be the average stocking rate for those stands throughout the Northeast. Of course, if you're planting trees, even if you're protecting them, they're not all going to survive. So, you're going to need to be planting hundreds of trees per acre if you don't have natural regeneration either helping or providing enough seedlings.
So David K asks, one of the alternative land uses you didn't focus on is residential development. Have people been looking at this in the context of reforestation barriers and opportunities?
A good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would say anecdotally, the kind of parcelization, people buying second homes or having a 5 or 10 acre plot of land around a primary home or a secondary home. Anecdotally, and you probably know better than I do, David, how common that is throughout the state, and whether those folks who own a piece of property primarily for residence are interested in tree planting. But in short, I don't have an answer for that question, but it is, you're right, that's an important competing use. Especially again for, if we had high density development, that's a relatively small area of land, but low density sprawl or exurban development can take up quite a bit of land.
So Sam Bosco asks, I am wondering if the presenters, analysts here would be interested in collaborating with agroforestry specialists in New York to quantitatively evaluate agroforestry for food, alley cropping, silvopasture, as another option for the beneficial use of marginal land, but is also sequestering carbon.
Short answer, yes. I think this is there aren't any good estimates of the kind of technical potential for this, and more importantly, the kind of economic and other practical potential for integrating more trees into existing farms. So as you mentioned, I use the example of silvopasture, but there are many other kinds of agroforestry, and I know you're interested in nut trees in particular, but yes, trees for producing nuts and fruits and various other products could be integrated into farms. And anytime we're adding trees, we're adding carbon to the landscape.
So Elise Brill asks, is there modeling work linking deer impacts to forest carbon sequestration? This work seems needed to influence the Climate Action Committee to take deer impacts more seriously and push for more aggressive deer management to support forest carbon sequestration.
Okay, so the question I heard is there analysis of the effect of deer on forest regeneration and carbon sequestration? Yes, there's quite a bit of that analysis. Most of it has focused on forest growth, but that directly translates to carbon, right? So if you're having a healthy growing forest, you're accumulating carbon, and if you don't have a healthy growing forest, you're not. It's very hard to control deer either through hunting or sterilization. This is not my area, but from the research I'm aware of, the research on that it's quite challenging. Say through intensive hunting or sterilization, it's really difficult to control deer enough to allow healthy regeneration of forests. Fences can be used, but those require a lot of maintenance, especially in forested areas where trees and branches fall on them. There's a technique called slash walls that's been developed by Peter Smallage and Brett Chedzoy, and is being implemented in New York and other places in the Northeast, where low value or non-commercial branches and tree material during a harvest, you can basically make a wall out of tops and some low value wood that keeps the deer out. This is expensive, but it has been shown to be highly effective in protecting regrowing stands from deer.
Okay, so I'm now going to present Charlie Canham's questions. It's a long commentary, but it's a nice segue to our next speaker on solar. Maybe Peter can try to respond to Rosemary and John in the chat afterwards. So Charlie says, the Carey Institute solar field contains 4,000 square meters of panels in a 1 hectare footprint. It generated 808 megawatt hours of electricity in 2021. These rates are right in line with national estimates of potential for 1 gigawatt production per 3 acres of solar footprint. Our best estimate of the net sequestration rates for New York forests over the next 50 years is 4.2 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare. That includes live tree biomass, detrital dynamics, and storage and harvested wood products, and is based on current harvest regimes and climate change impacts. New York's electric power production generates 0.49 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per megawatt hours. This is 2020 data, with a total emission of 26.7 million metric tons of CO2 from 54.4 million megawatt hours of fossil fuel sourced electricity. So 1.7 million acres of land could be expected to offset 10.7% at most of current greenhouse gas emissions of New York's electricity generation. But those rates would easily take 10 to 20 years to achieve as plantations accelerated their rates of growth. So 10.7% is a liberal and overestimate of sequestration. So taking just 1% of that 1.7 million acres, that is 17,000 acres or 6,800 hectares, would generate 5.6 million megawatt hours of electricity or 10.2% of fossil fuel sourced generation. So given all the other values, including important biodiversity values of that 1.7 million acres, why would you want to plant trees when using just 1% of the land could achieve the same net reduction in greenhouse gases, along with eliminating the other pollutions associated with fossil fuel use? So,
great question. I'll answer this in brief, and then our next talk can answer it at more length. It's not either or. So this is why I focused on the idea that even if we reduce emissions as much as we possibly can, and that means maximizing renewable energy production in the state, after we maximize that production and put all the panels that we can practically use and all the windmills we can practically use, there will still be a need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's what I was focusing on. Again, it's not an either or question here. We need a lot more renewables as soon as possible. And I would argue we also want to look for opportunities to plant trees in ways that are provide multiple benefits, including carbon sequestration.
okay.
And I just acknowledge, Charlie Cannon's an expert in this area, so check out all the numbers he's presenting are based on rigorous research, and they're well worth checking out.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was great.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.